These were tombs of the rich people who could afford to build these tombs. The mysterious thing about these tombs is that they're carved off the mountain. How were they able to carve buildings like this?
High on the cliffs of Turkey, carved into sheer rock faces that no ordinary person could ever climb, lie tombs that have baffled explorers for centuries. Perfectly shaped, eerily silent, and seemingly unreachable, these ancient monuments hold a mystery unlike anything else in the world.
You can still see ancient carvings. 1827. Well, these are from the 4th century BC, so I guess that's not from that.
For decades, no one could explain how or why they were made. Now, at last, a stunning breakthrough has given us an answer. But it raises even more unsettling questions. What secret did these cliff tombs guard for so long? The forgotten coast of mystery. Southwest Turkey's Mediterranean coast is often sold in travel brochures with words like turquoise, sunlit, and paradise. From Fethiye to Antalya, it is a mosaic of hidden coves, ancient harbors, and cliffs that plunge into the sea. To the casual traveler, it looks like the perfect holiday escape, sailing routes dotted with gullets, seaside villages, and endless beaches. But behind this postcard surface lies one of the strangest and least understood civilizations in human history. This was Lycia. To most, the name is barely familiar, a footnote in Greek myth or an obscure province swallowed by Rome. Yet the Lycians thrived for centuries, built competitive cities, and left behind evidence of a society far more advanced than expected. Their ruins are not buried under desert sands like Egypt, nor swallowed by jungle like the Maya. They are simply there, half overgrown on lonely hillsides, or staring silently from cliffs that defy reason. When archaeologists first began to explore the Lycian coast in the 19th century, what they found was baffling. Whole cities were carved into mountainsides. Tombs resembling wooden houses and temples were cut high into sheer cliffs, often hundreds of feet above the ground. And these weren't isolated oddities. They appeared everywhere, in Xanthos, Pinara, Klos, Myra, and dozens of other sites. Stranger still was how invisible they seemed to history. Unlike the monuments of Greece or Rome, Lycian ruins never became iconic. They waited quietly for centuries, overlooked and almost forgotten. Yet they were by no means inconsiderable. Homer proved that in his Iliad, for they were fierce allies of Troy, led in battle by the warrior Sarpedon. Famed throughout the Aegean for naval skill and liberty, the Persians tried to subdue them. Alexander the Great marched through their land, and eventually Rome included them in its empire. But before all that, Lycia had already accomplished something most extraordinary: a federation of city-states that operated without kings. The Lycian League balanced independence against unity. Centuries before Athens would experiment with democracy and inspire political thinkers from Rome to those who created the U.S. Constitution. But today's wonders are the tombs, which seem less like graves than functions as some kind of high towers of memory. Some are small and simple, cut just above ground level. Others, monumental facades that employ freestanding columns, pediments, and crude imitation wooden-beamed structures that have long since disappeared. Tombs cut so high into vertical cliffs that no traces remain of ropes, scaffolding, or paths leading to them. Even today, their placement defies logic. Standing below them, you cannot help but wonder, how did the Lycians do this? Why place their dead where the living could never return? For most civilizations, monuments were about power. Pharaohs built pyramids to declare divinity. Roman generals erected mausoleums to outlast memory. But the Lycian tombs do not shout. They whisper. They feel personal, even intimate, as if each family carved its own story into stone, not to dominate the world, but to preserve memory. It is this quiet defiance, this refusal to play by the rules of empire, that makes Lycia so mysterious. Today, still, the Lycian coast looks like paradise. But if you know where to look, paradise is lined with tombs, numerous, silent, and inaccessible hoards, still keeping secrets carved into stone 25 centuries ago. And this is where the mystery begins, because those tombs don't just tell us who the Lycians were. They force us to question how much of their story has slipped through history's cracks. A language that spoke from stone. When travelers walk among Lycian ruins today, it isn't just the tombs and temples that command attention, but the inscriptions etched into them. Strange letters, carved carefully into limestone, still cling to the cliffs like whispers frozen in time. For centuries, no one could read them. The alphabet looked vaguely familiar. Its shapes resembled Greek, but the words carried no meaning. The letters formed a code without a key, a language that had slipped through the cracks of memory. This was Lycian, one of the great linguistic enigmas of the ancient world. Unlike Greek, Latin, or even Hittite, Lycian never spread widely or left behind libraries of texts. It survived in funerary epitaphs, civic decrees, and boundary stones scattered across cliffsides. For centuries after the civilization vanished, no one knew what the inscriptions meant. They were like voices calling across time, unheard. Scholars puzzled over them for generations. Some thought Lycian was a Greek dialect. Others saw connections to Luwian, spoken inland, but every attempt to decode stalled. There wasn't enough material. Without a bilingual inscription, a Rosetta Stone equivalent, Lycian remained impenetrable. The breakthrough came at Latun, a sanctuary near modern Fethiye, where archaeologists uncovered a trilingual inscription. The same text appeared in Lycian, Greek, and Aramaic. At last, there was a key. Just as the Rosetta Stone opened Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Latun stele cracked open Lycian. Progress was slow and remains incomplete. Even now, scholars cannot translate every word with certainty. Yet, what has been uncovered is startling. Lycian inscriptions are not the proclamations of kings or empires. They are deeply personal, often funerary texts that sound disarmingly modern. One reads, "Do not violate this grave. I was beloved, and now I rest." Another threatens intruders with a curse, promising misfortune to those who disturb the tomb. These words are not ceremonial abstractions. In contrast to any other civilization of ancient times, stone inscriptions in Lycia distinguished the intimacy of being. For most of such ancient civilizations, stone inscriptions glorified rulers, listed titles, or honored gods. Egyptian tombs catalogued offerings for eternity. Roman epitaphs celebrated victories. The Lycians carved into remembrance, love, and lamentation. An expression meant not for posterity in the philosophical sense, but presumably for any traveler in time that might halt for a moment and read after everybody else has passed on. Nevertheless, the very language itself faded exceedingly fast. By the late 4th century BCE, with Alexander the Great passing through, Greek had already begun replacing Lycian. One generation or two, and Lycian was completely lost to view. No dialects, no evolution, no descendants. Silent itself, it left only stone voices behind. Why this rapidity of disappearance? How can a culture with a powerful federation, a proud identity, and thriving cities just erase its language? Greek, Latin, and Aramaic all endured in that region for centuries. Some scholars place Hellenistic assimilation as a foil for the Lycians. Others wonder whether the Lycians did not deliberately allow their language to decline and chose integration instead of resistance. Today, there are only bits and pieces left. Scholars can infer names, place names, and general plans, but the real thing is still largely a mystery. It is as though they had half-formed a puzzle half-glimpsed and never wholly understood. Every supplementary discovery recycled out of its archaic meaning, another boundary stone uncovered, and, say, a tomb inscription discovered through forceful extrication from ivy merely snowballs. It all values higher about the forbidden language. Perhaps this is what makes Lycian even more evocative. Its words are not of the glory of fallen great nations, but are of a person and of their poignant parting. They serve as a gentle reminder that behind the federations and cliff-carved tombs, there were beings who loved, were lost in sorrow, and were shielded against oblivion. And while their words are fractured, they still speak across 2,500 years, reminding us that history is never as silent as it seems. The league that defied empires. When most people think of ancient politics, the mind jumps to pharaohs, emperors, or kings, rulers who claimed divine right and enforced authority through armies. But in the rugged mountains and turquoise harbors of Lycia, something radically different was taking shape. While empires obsessed over central power, the Lycians built something else entirely: a federation. A system where cities governed themselves yet came together under a common framework. The Lycian League was no loose alliance. It was a structured political system that bound more than 20 city-states into a single federation. Each city retained independence but sent delegates to an assembly. Votes were weighted. Major centers like Xanthos and Patara carried more influence, but smaller towns still had a voice. A chief magistrate, the Lyciarch, presided over collective decisions. What makes this remarkable is not just that it existed, but that it worked. The Lycians balanced autonomy with unity, something far larger civilizations often failed to achieve. Unlike the Greek city-states, which spent centuries at war with one another, the Lycian cities found ways to cooperate. They defended each other when threatened, set fair rules for trade, and allowed each city to keep its own customs. This was centuries ahead of its time. Historians like Strabo and Cicero later praised the League as a model of governance. When Rome absorbed Lycia, the system was not dissolved, a rare honor, since Rome usually swept away local institutions. Instead, they recognized its effectiveness and preserved it. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers such as Alexander Hamilton would cite the Lycian League in the Federalist Papers as an example of federalism. But the uniqueness of the League went beyond structure. It reflected a culture that prized individuality without losing sight of the collective. You can see the same spirit in their tombs, each one distinct, carved as a personal statement of memory. Their politics echoed this ethos. Every city had its voice, yet all voices together created something greater than the sum of its parts. It wasn't about dynasties or rulers, it was about balance. How can it be that a small federation turned out to be a fairly progressive system, as monarchs ruled over the ancient world? They weren't copying Greece, since their system predated Athens, as evidence suggests. Nor was it due to conquest. Only geography really shaped the League. Scattered valleys and coastal harbors where cooperation was the only way to survive. It lasted for centuries. The League of Lycia survived during the Persians' and the Macedonians' rule under Alexander the Great, and even against the Romans. But alas, such political strength could not save Lycia from cultural assimilation. As the Greek language and its customs spread across the Mediterranean, Lycian culture faded slowly. In the 2nd century AD, The League still existed nominally, but became absorbed in the Roman world. The irony smells sharp. A nation that has invented democracy, that has found that balance between freedom and unity, and has won the respect of empires, has vanished. The system survived. It had echoes into Rome and finally to America. But the Lycians themselves did not. Their daily lives, their names, their voices slipped into silence. And that raises the haunting question: why? Why would such a progressive society background key political texts, monuments to its leaders, and almost no literature? Was this an expression of humility? A conscious rejection of ego? Or was it simply the price to pay quietly for being absorbed by greater empires? One positive answer: the Lycian League was far ahead of its time, yet today almost no one remembers it. Its funerary monuments remain, its inscriptions whisper softly, but its political genius is hardly thought about at all. And perhaps this is also why there are writers like Graham Hancock who are fascinated with Lycia, not myths about Atlantis, but myths grounded simply in the reality that seem ill at ease. A confederation that stood against empires, echoed in history, and vanished. But if their political system was remarkable, their architecture was even stranger. Because what they carved into cliffs still defies explanation. Even today, tombs that shouldn't exist. Some ruins inspire awe, others raise questions. And then there are the Lycian cliff tombs, monuments so bold, so inaccessible, that the first reaction isn't admiration, but disbelief. Standing beneath them, carved into vertical cliffs hundreds of feet above the ground, you can't help but ask the same question scholars and travelers have for centuries. How on earth did they build that? Unlike pyramids or Roman mausoleums, Lycian tombs were not colossal blocks dominating landscapes. They were intimate, intricate, and impossibly placed. Entire facades were sculpted into living rock to mimic wooden houses and temples, roof lines, columns, even imitations of wooden joints, etched with obsessive precision. These weren't crude caves hacked into mountainsides. They were personal homes for the dead, carved with architectural detail that feels deliberate, almost defiant. But it's their placement that makes them extraordinary. Many tombs perch on sheer cliffs, with no trace of stairs, scaffolding, or access routes. Even today, reaching them would require advanced climbing gear. In ancient times, without cranes or steel tools, building them seemed nearly impossible. Archaeologists theorize wooden scaffolding, pulleys, or supports, yet no evidence remains. The cliffs are smooth, silent of answers. Some tombs sit in positions so precarious that even imagining construction feels absurd. The most famous, the tomb of Amyntas in modern-day Phthia, towers with Ionic columns carved in the 4th century BCE. From the valley, it looks less like a grave and more like an eternal monument, commanding presence without armies or gold. Inside, however, there is nothing ornate. No sarcophagi, no treasures, just emptiness. As if the tomb's true purpose was never the body within, but the message carved into the mountain itself. That message remains debated. Some argue the height symbolized closeness to the gods, placing the dead between earth and sky. Others suggest the inaccessibility protected against looters, yet even that feels insufficient. Why go to such extremes, carving hundreds of tombs across the region in places family could never visit? It is the particularity that deepens the mystery. All the Lycian tombs are different. Some look like wooden cabins, others are full temples, and yet others are just empty rooms. The inscriptions carved into doorways imbue the monuments with a starkly human quality. Personal names, family names, harsh requirements. Unlike the more commercial epitaphs we are familiar with from other cultures, Lycian words seem really to speak intimately. A man proclaiming that he was loved, a family beseeching respect, an intruder warning. And they are everywhere. Ugliness caused by man. Tombs dot the cliffs around Xanthos, Pinara, Myra, and Tlos, some clustering together like ancient high-rises for the dead, some standing solitary and melancholy. Together, they form a necropolis hacked out of stone and stand against time itself. Not only did they achieve incredible feats technically, but they also survived in the bargain. For decades upon centuries, earthquakes and wars, empires and religions flooded Anatolia. But these tombs remain. Unlike repurposed temples, melted statues, or defaced monuments, tombs were left intact for the most part. Many stand almost as they were built, defiant, silent, eternal. The effect here is very eerie. Under them, one feels, besides history, presence, as though the ancients had carved memory into cliffs to be ensured still watching them. And perhaps that was the point. However, for those like Graham Hancock, who are attracted to ancient mysteries, wonders, the tombs, the corresponding evidence of knowledge and purpose that denies elimination from neat historical timelines, Hancock once called them impossible, not because of aliens, but because their very existence pushes aside all the facts compelling to admit how much we still do not know. That is their true power. And it's here where Graham Hancock's fascination with Lycia deepens, turning this forgotten federation into one of history's most unsettling anomalies. Lycia, through Hancock's eyes. For decades, Graham Hancock has been known as the man who looks at history sideways. Where others see neat timelines, he sees gaps, blind spots, and anomalies. When he turned his attention to the Lycian civilization in southwestern Turkey, he found something that fit all three. This time, Hancock wasn't chasing myths of Atlantis or forgotten kings. What drew him to Lycia was the strangeness of the facts themselves, facts archaeologists have catalogued but rarely spotlighted. A democratic federation centuries before Athens, a unique language that vanished almost overnight, tombs carved into sheer cliffs with no clear method of access. And most unsettling, a civilization advanced enough to achieve all this, yet obscure enough that most people have never heard its name. In interviews with alternative historians, Hancock described the Lycian tombs as impossible, not in a mystical sense, but in execution. How did a non-imperial culture with modest resources achieve such precision in locations even modern climbers struggle to reach? For Hancock, this wasn't about aliens or lost technology, but about human ability and how much of it history may underestimate or forget. What intrigued him most was placement. The tombs weren't practical. They weren't built for rituals or visitation. They seemed designed for endurance, for permanence, to be seen from afar. It's almost as though they wanted to carve their memory into eternity, Hancock suggested. That motive felt alien compared to the glory-driven monuments of Egypt or Rome. Then came the political system. The Lycian League, a federation of city-states with proportional voting, impressed even Rome, which preserved it after conquest. Centuries later, Enlightenment thinkers such as Alexander Hamilton would cite it while shaping the U.S. Constitution. For Hancock, this was no footnote. It was proof that Lycia had experimented with political ideas long before mainstream narratives allowed. Language otherwise made the mystery thick. It was deciphered only in part through a trilingual inscription, revealing startlingly personal texts in Lycian, funerary messages sounding all credited within a conversational context. What can be little more than grave warnings chiseled into tombs alive with stingers millennia? The people of this one valued individuality and emotion, but just in the voice, quite clearly absent in the 4th century BCE. For Hancock, almost within it, such a disappearance felt forced. It's as if they wrote clearly enough to remind us they were here, but not enough for us to ever understand them fully. To him, Lycia was perfectly apart, not because hidden, but just overlooked. All ruins come really out into plain sight along Turkey's coast, yet tourists all sail on by, unaware. Archaeologists mention Lycia, but never stop by for a visit. That silence certainly gives it power. For Hancock, it makes history rethink. It makes it necessary to make the mind rethink something. Human progress is an actual surface. The track it leaves more like a tapestry beaten with past experiments and lone flashes of brilliance than a very straight line from primitive to advanced. The Lycian League is a prototype for democracy centuries before Athens. Those tombs show a kind of engineering that defies logic understood and heard within the voice of the language, which disappears mid-sentence. They suggest that our narrative of civilization must be missing crucial chapters from it. That is why Hancock calls Lycia impossible. Not because there aren't pieces that match the puzzle together, but because they aren't the right pieces. Lycia isn't just one of those forgotten cultures. It reminds us that there's a lot of history with blind spots. On the other hand, the most extraordinary civilizations might be just under our noses as well. But Lycia's story doesn't end with Hancock's fascination, because while its ruins may be quiet, their endurance raises an even bigger question. What if this silence isn't an accident at all, but a design? Silence that endured for millennia. The ruins of Lycia do not shout their story the way Egypt's pyramids or Rome's forums do. They whisper, quiet on hillsides, carved into cliffs, waiting for someone to look up and notice. That silence, haunting and deliberate, may be their greatest mystery. Unlike civilizations that fell with fire or conquest, the Lycians simply faded away. Not suddenly, but completely. By the 4th century BCE, their unique language had gone silent. Greek replaced inscriptions that once carried emotional warnings and heartfelt farewells. By the Roman era, the Lycian League still existed, but only as a shadow of itself. A federation tolerated rather than truly alive. The people blended into empires, their individuality dissolving into larger identities. Slowly, their distinct culture disappeared, leaving behind only what was carved into stone. This is what makes their silence unsettling. Other cultures left libraries, chronicles, and monuments to kings. Lycia left cliff tombs unreachable by ordinary hands, personal inscriptions, and a federation centuries ahead of its time. And then, nothing. No collapse. No final battle. Just absorption into the noise of history. Almost as if they chose to vanish quietly, without leaving us a neat story. Perhaps that quietness was intentional. Their tombs suggest a people obsessed with permanence, but not spectacle. Unlike pyramids meant to awe, Lycian tombs are intimate. They mimic houses, not temples. They honor families, not dynasties. They preserve memory, not power. Maybe the silence was part of their design. The Lycians may not have sought eternal fame, but eternal presence, a presence carved into cliffs so enduring that, even without their voices, we still see them. The endurance itself is astonishing. Earthquakes, wars, and empires passed, yet the tombs still hang in cliffs. Many remain untouched, ignored even by looters. While other monuments were reused, repainted, or destroyed, Lycia's tombs were left alone. Protected not only by their height and inaccessibility, but also by an aura of reverence. That stillness feels eerie, as if the Lycians achieved exactly what they intended, to be remembered without being fully understood. The same silence that fascinates modern researchers surrounded anyone who built democratic rows before Athens, carved tombs with strict music into mountains, and wrote texts as personal as they were, as a tragical aspect forgotten, well part of the grandiose plan of becoming a part of Greece and Rome. Did they believe their tombs to outlast the Celts, the Angles, or the French when all had ruined each of their cities before these men, or of strategies such that troublesome decisions breed success from centuries of calamities? Position yourself today at Myra or Phethiae, and the silence is quite extraordinary. For there, no hordes of visitors, no museums, no massive tourist attractions. The tombs remain, solo, picked up on the stone walls over the vales where all the living have passed so long ago. They come across, hearing the poet whisper, sometimes with more dignity to its call, "The power of endurance can be louder than all the ancient glories." This must also be given as a reason why so many, like Hancock, linger over the Lycia treasury. Mysterious no longer necessitates a myth of Atlantis, for the real mystery lies in all that got left behind and in all that simply walked away, language lost. The simple culture that slipped away. The confederation that forgot her. Yet the tombs still stand, stating they will never die. Emptying out silence for Lycia is not an emptiness. It is an affirmation. A culture that prided itself on individualism rather than empire, permanence over spectacle, memory over fame, chose to make statements on cliffs with whispers and have everything else vanish. Take it or leave it. In that choice, it has haunted us more deeply than if it had left volumes of texts or towering palaces. And yet, even this haunting silence leaves one final question. If Lycia was able to design its own disappearance, what was the real message they wanted us to see? What the tombs still whisper today. When we step back from the cliffs, the tombs, and the fragments of language, a larger picture of Lycia begins to form. Not a complete one, never complete, but enough to sense intention. The Lycians did not leave sprawling empires, immortalize kings, or build monuments to dominate horizons. Instead, they carved messages into the living earth, choosing permanence without spectacle, memory without noise. That is the message still waiting for us in stone. Their choices reveal much. Lycia's democracy came before Athens, yet left no triumphant texts to boast of it. Their language carried emotions and warnings, yet slipped quietly into Greek. Their architecture reached impossible heights, but never sought to overwhelm like pyramids or ziggurats. Again and again, the Lycians seemed less interested in being remembered by the masses than in being understood by those willing to look closely. A civilization built not on shouting greatness, but whispering truth. That truth may be this: what matters is not how loudly you are remembered, but how deeply. The tombs were not shrines for daily visitation or propaganda. They were reminders. Each held a name, a story, a message etched into eternity. The Lycians dared to believe memory itself was worth preserving, not as part of a vast empire, but as individual voices still speaking from stone. This is what unsettles us most. Other ancient cultures became myths of conquest and power. Lycia resists that. It offers no neat story of rise and fall, heroism or tragedy. It leaves us fragments, a federation ahead of its time, a language half understood, tombs that defy logic, and silence that endures. The puzzle never fits together cleanly, and that unease is the point. We crave closure, but the Lycians never offered any. Perhaps what they wanted us to see was what history often conceals: humanity. "I was beloved," inscriptions read, tombs carved like homes of the living. Presumably, it was a federation valuing balance over dominance. Very choice indeed, to leave ruins and memories. Modern anthropologists, historians, and explorers like Graham Hancock view Lycia as more than just an anomaly. They view it as a reminder that history is not a straight line. Civilizations can flourish in ways we do not expect. They may thrive on systems we deem modern. They choose permanence in ways we do not value anymore, and they will fade away without any cataclysmic event, silently, choosing silence over spectacle. What Lycia carved onto stone could be more than a tomb. It could be viewed as a warning. Fame decays, empires fall, even the loudest disputations of history fall silent. What remains is the choice we imprint on the world, the truths carved into the portals of time, not for everyone, but certainly visible to anyone who chooses to see. To stand below the cliffs at Myra, or to look up at the tomb of Amyntas in Phthia, is not to look upon a monument. Instead, it is to look upon a philosophy, memory, individuality, permanence mattering more than conquest. The Lycians may be gone, but their message survives. In every wall as silent as a tomb, in every inscription only half deciphered, in every inaccessible chamber carved into the stone. Perhaps that is why Lycia feels haunted. Because it is not gone, but is still living from within the mountains, providing the whisper of a truth never understood in empires. Legacy is not ruling this world. It is leaving behind something so defining, so quintessentially human, that it compels the future to stop, look upwards, and wonder. And that wraps up today's mystery. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit the like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. And before you go, check out the next video appearing on your screen right now. It's one you won't want to miss.